In the late 1980s, Paris was not just the city of light. It was gripped by a chilling wave of fear. Dozens of elderly women were brutally murdered in their own homes. At first glance, the crimes seemed unrelated, but beneath the surface, a sinister pattern emerged. A cold, calculated killer striking swiftly, mercilessly, leaving behind no trace. The police launched an intense manhunt, but the murderer moved like a ghost in the night, vanishing after every kill. It wasn't until late 1987, when vital clues finally surfaced, that the identity of the killer was revealed. Thierry Paulin, a man with a deeply scarred past and an insatiable thirst for blood. When captured, he showed no fear, no remorse. In fact, he relished the spotlight, embracing his newfound infamy. The media dubbed him the monster of Montmartre. What could have driven a young man to become such a cold-blooded killer? And did justice truly prevail? This is the story of one of the most horrifying crime sprees in French history, where even the dazzling lights of Paris could not hide the terror lurking in the shadows. Paris, the capital of France, known worldwide as the City of Light. A city of timeless elegance, rich history, and artistic grandeur. Nestled along the banks of the River Seine, its charming streets and iconic landmarks have inspired generations. At the heart of it all lies Montmartre, one of the most enchanting districts in the city. Towering 130 meters above the skyline, it is a place of painters, poets, and dreamers. But during the 1980s, this picturesque quarter was consumed by a darkness it had never known before. A series of violent robberies and murders targeting elderly women shocked the public. The killer, soon nicknamed the Monster of Montmartre, vanished without a trace after every crime, leaving a city terrified and law enforcement baffled. The story of Thierry Paulin begins far from the glamour of Paris. He was born on November 28, 1963, on the Caribbean island of Martinique. His mother, Monette, was just 17 years old at the time. His father abandoned them before he was even born, leaving Monette to raise her child alone. At just 18 months old, Paulin was sent to live with his grandmother, a woman too busy managing a restaurant to care for him properly. He grew up neglected, emotionally isolated, and starved for affection. This lack of love bred rebellion. Paulin became a troubled child, restless, aggressive, and always seeking attention. In 1973, there was a brief period of calm when his mother remarried. But the peace didn't last. Paulin's behavior remained volatile, and he began bullying his step-siblings. His stepfather saw him as a burden. Desperate, Monette contacted Paulin's biological father in Toulouse, hoping for support. Though the man refused to help financially, he offered to take Paulin in. Reluctantly, Monette agreed. At the age of 12, Paulin moved to Toulouse to live with a father he barely knew, but the attempt to reconnect failed. His father showed him little warmth, and Paulin found himself just as isolated as before. He drifted into street life, joining a local biker gang. Though he was the only person of color in the group, he was accepted. Brotherhood born not of love, but of shared rage and alienation. The turning point came during a heated argument, when Paulin confessed to his father that he was gay. His father exploded in fury. That moment would leave a deep and lasting scar. In 1980, at age 17, Paulin enlisted in the military. He was assigned as a barber within the parachute regiment. There, he fully embraced his identity. But unlike the acceptance he'd once found in the biker gang, the military was far less tolerant. His fellow soldiers ostracized him, both for his sexuality and his skin color. After 2 years of enduring harassment and discrimination, Paulin was dishonorably discharged for shoplifting. He tried joining other branches of the armed forces, but his criminal record shut every door. Crushed by rejection, he moved to Paris to live with his mother once again, no longer bound by rules and ready to reinvent himself. Just 1 month later, the violence returned. On Avenue Clichy, 71-year-old Luana Secaresco, a retired schoolteacher, was found dead in her apartment. She had been savagely beaten, her nose and jaw broken, ribs fractured. Cause of death? Suffocation. This time, the killer took 10,000 francs in cash. 2 days after that, 84-year-old Alice Benham was found by her son only hours after she had been murdered. Her body was bound with electrical cords, her mouth was stuffed with cloth. Her face showed bruises from a severe beating. Like the others, she died from asphyxiation. But this time, traces of corrosive chemicals were found on her skin. The killer had become more reckless and more experimental. Within just 4 weeks, 4 women were murdered in the same neighborhood. Paris trembled. The police connected the dots. All victims were elderly women. The motive? Robbery. The method? Identical. Word spread quickly. News outlets warned elderly women to stay alert. But instead of stopping, Paulin and his now active partner intensified their spree. The very next day, 80-year-old Marie Choi was killed in her home, just 20 meters from the previous crime scene. She was bound with steel wire. Her skull was fractured. Cause of death? Once again, suffocation. In the 4 days that followed, 3 more elderly women were murdered in the 18th arrondissement. All of them tied up, all of them beaten, all of them left to die. The media dubbed the unknown assailant the killer of old women, butcher of the 18th. The streets of Montmartre, once alive with music and laughter, now fell silent at night. Shops closed early. Women lived in fear. And the police, overwhelmed. They had one piece of solid evidence, a fingerprint. But it matched no one in their database. There were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no leads. The only logical conclusion? The killer was someone the victims trusted, or someone who looked trustworthy enough to be let in. Meanwhile, Paulin and his boyfriend left Paris, retreating to Toulouse to avoid the heat. But Toulouse offered no peace. Paulin argued with his estranged father, lashed out at his partner, and eventually returned to Paris alone. This time, more ruthless than ever. By December 1985, Paulin was back in Paris, alone. His relationship had crumbled. He had no one to split the stolen money with. And without anyone holding him back, he grew even more methodical and more vicious. In the 14th arrondissement, 91-year-old Estelle Dujardin was found strangled in her home. No witnesses, no forced entry, same brutal precision. 3 weeks later, 3 more elderly women in the same neighborhood met the same fate. But this time, something had changed. The victims hadn't been beaten. Their bodies were left relatively intact. To investigators, this raised a chilling question. Was it the same killer or a copycat? Then came January 1986. 4 more women were murdered in quick succession. Faced with mounting pressure, Paris police launched an unprecedented manhunt. They reviewed files on over 60 prior robbery murders. Officers raided bars, nightclubs, and gay venues across the city. Patrols increased. City officials even offered an escort service for elderly women who felt unsafe walking alone. And finally, after almost 2 years, science caught up with the killer. While fingerprint databases were primitive in the 1980s, a team of forensic specialists decided to manually compare latent prints collected across all crime scenes. After weeks of tedious, eye-straining analysis, they found a match. All the murders, from the 18th arrondissement to the 14th, had been committed by the same man. The total number of confirmed victims? 18. But then suddenly, it all stopped. No more deaths. No new scenes. No more horror. For nearly a year, the monster of Montmartre vanished from the headlines. Unbeknownst to investigators, Thierry Paulin had already been caught, but not for murder. In August 1986, Thierry Paulin found himself in trouble once again, but this time, not for murder. He had been buying cocaine from a dealer, only to realize he'd been scammed. Enraged, Paulin snapped. He beat the man with a baseball bat and threatened him with a gun. The dealer called the police. Both men were arrested. Paulin was charged with assault and sentenced to 1 year and 9 months in prison at Fleury-Mérogis, one of France's largest detention centers. As part of the intake process, his fingerprints were officially recorded and added to the National Criminal Database. But back then, without automated matching systems, those prints were buried among over 150,000 sets. Manually matching fingerprints was a daunting task, slow, tedious, and often delayed for months. So while Paris police were desperately searching for a faceless killer, the man they were hunting sat behind bars, hidden in plain sight. By the summer of 1987, Paulin was released early for good behavior, but freedom came with a cruel twist of fate. On the very same day he walked out of prison, he received devastating news. He had tested positive for HIV. The diagnosis shattered him. Filled with rage and a twisted sense of revenge, Paulin made a vow. He would take down as many people as possible before his time ran out. He would make society pay. He returned to Paris, slipping back into the gay nightclub scene. With bleached blonde hair, designer clothes, and a silver tongue, he crafted the image of a successful entrepreneur, claiming he owned a modeling agency and fashion business. People believed him. Behind the charm and polish, though, Paulin was planning his final killing spree. November 1987. Barely out of prison, Thierry Paulin returned to his old ways. Faster, bolder, deadlier. He had nothing to lose. And time was running out. On November 17th, 79-year-old Rachel Cohen was found dead in her apartment in the 10th arrondissement. 2 days later, just 100 meters away, 87-year-old Berthe Finalteri was attacked and left in a coma. Her face pressed into a mattress until she nearly suffocated. Then, on November 19th, 73-year-old Geneviève Germain was found murdered. She would become Paulin's final confirmed victim. In less than 3 days, 3 women had been brutally attacked in a small radius, but Paulin didn't flee. He threw himself a lavish birthday party. On November 28, 1987, his 24th birthday, he booked a luxury hotel suite and invited dozens of guests. Champagne flowed. Waiters served gourmet dishes. Paulin, dressed in a tailored suit, charmed his guests with witty conversation and dazzling smiles. To the outside world, he was a refined socialite, but just days earlier, one of his victims had survived. Berthe Finalteri, left for dead, regained consciousness. And she remembered everything. She described her attacker in stunning detail. A tall man, around 1.80 meters, mixed race, dyed platinum blonde hair, earrings, fashion-forward clothing. In 1987 Paris, this look was rare and unforgettable. Her description was turned into a police sketch and distributed to the press. The hunt reignited, and this time, the monster had a face. December 1st, 1987. In the heart of the 10th arrondissement, Chief Inspector Denis was chatting casually with a colleague outside the precinct. In his pocket was the sketch of the suspect, based on Berthe Finalteri's description. As the two officers spoke, Denis's eyes locked onto a man walking casually down the street. Platinum blonde hair, earrings, athletic wear, tall, mixed race. The match was instant and chilling. Acting on instinct, Denis approached the man and asked for identification. The man didn't resist. He calmly handed over his papers and even rolled up his sleeves, expecting the officer was checking for drug use. But Denis wasn't looking for tracks. He was looking for a killer. He brought the man back to the station for further questioning. His name? Thierry Paulin. Once inside, police took his fingerprints and compared them to those collected from multiple murder scenes over the last 3 years. The result? A perfect match. The monster of Montmartre had finally been caught. At first, Thierry Paulin remained calm. He denied everything, demanded a lawyer, sat in silence, but the detectives were patient. Then, they placed in front of him a plastic bottle containing a corrosive substance. the same type used in one of the murders back in 1984. Paulin flinched, a barely perceptible reaction, but enough. The mask cracked. Realizing he had slipped, Paulin gave up the facade. He began to talk. Over the course of 43 hours of intense interrogation, Paulin confessed to 21 brutal attacks, resulting in 19 confirmed murders. He described his crimes in horrifying detail, his words disturbingly casual, almost mechanical, but he didn't take full responsibility. Instead, he shifted much of the blame onto his former lover and accomplice, Jean-Thierry Mathurin. According to Paulin, the two had planned and carried out many of the murders together. Their method was chillingly simple. They would follow elderly women home from the street, strike up friendly conversations, then force their way inside. Once inside, the violence was swift and fatal. The motive? Not just money, not even survival, power, control, the thrill. Paulin admitted, "I only attacked those who were weak." As Paulin laid bare the horrors he committed, another name surfaced again and again: Jean-Thierry Mathurin. According to Paulin, Mathurin wasn't just a lover, he was a partner in crime. The two had met while working in Paris's nightclub scene. Mathurin, just 19 at the time, was from French Guiana. Like Paulin, he carried the scars of a broken past. He had been abused by his brother-in-law and later fell into drug addiction. Together, the two formed a toxic, codependent relationship built on pain, trauma, and blood. Paulin said Mathurin introduced him to hard drugs. In return, Paulin became his supplier, his protector, and eventually his co-conspirator. They lived together in cheap hotels, performed at drag clubs, argued, made up, and plotted. Their love was volatile, their nights deadly. Police quickly tracked Mathurin down and brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, but faced with Paulin's testimony, he cracked. He admitted to participating in several murders in the 18th arrondissement, but the love between them? Long gone. Mathurin refused to even say Paulin's name. He called him simply that person. Their bond, once forged in fire and fury, had disintegrated into disgust. Paulin was sent back to Fleury-Mérogis prison. Even behind bars, he remained obsessed with appearances. He carefully folded his designer clothes, requested dry cleaning, wore tailored pants and a tuxedo tailcoat when allowed. He had become what he always dreamed of, a star, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. 6 years after the first murder, a trial finally took place, not for Paulin, but for his former lover and accomplice, Jean-Thierry Mathurin. Held at the Court of Appeal in Paris, the trial drew intense public scrutiny. Mathurin was charged with 8 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder. Throughout the proceedings, he showed no emotion. He even smiled, mockingly. No remorse, no apology, only cold indifference. In the end, the court sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. The public was furious. 18 years for 8 lives. Mathurin was transferred to La Santé prison, notorious for its harsh conditions. There he remained silent, almost invisible. Illiterate at the time of his arrest, he began learning to read using children's comic books. Whether out of guilt, boredom, or a desire to change, no one could say. And then, in May 2009, Mathurin was quietly released, granted parole after serving his minimum term. 8 lives, exchanged for 18 years behind bars. Some recognized him on the streets. Others avoided him. He lived in the shadows, often harassed, sometimes threatened. Though free, he would never truly escape his past. More than 3 decades have passed since Thierry Paulin terrorized the streets of Paris. 6 years after the first murder, a trial finally took place, not for Paulin, but for his former lover and accomplice, Jean-Thierry Mathurin. Held at the Court of Appeal in Paris, the trial drew intense public scrutiny. Mathurin was charged with 8 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder. Throughout the proceedings, he showed no emotion. He even smiled, mockingly. No remorse, No apology. Only cold indifference. In the end, the court sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. The public was furious. 18 years for 8 lives. Mathurin was transferred to La Santé prison, notorious for its harsh conditions. There he remained silent, almost invisible. Illiterate at the time of his arrest, he began learning to read using children's comic books. Whether out of guilt, boredom, or a desire to change, no one could say. And then, in May 2009, Mathurin was quietly released, granted parole after serving his minimum term. 8 lives, exchanged for 18 years behind bars. Some recognized him on the streets. Others avoided him. He lived in the shadows, often harassed, sometimes threatened. Though free, he would never truly escape his past. More than 3 decades have passed since Thierry Paulin terrorized the streets of Paris. His story continues to haunt France, not just because of the horrific murders, but because of what it revealed about society. It exposed the cracks in the justice system, the blind spots in law enforcement, and the devastating impact of a shattered childhood. To this day, many wonder, did Paulin truly kill out of hate for women? Was he seeking vengeance for a mother who never loved him? Or was it something darker? A thirst for control, a need to feel powerful, even if just for a fleeting moment? Not all of his victims were robbed. Some were murdered for just a handful of coins. It wasn't about money. It was about the feeling, the rush, the dominance, the destruction. And what about Jean-Thierry Mathurin? Was he a manipulated partner, pulled into a vortex of drugs and violence? Or was he just as guilty, hiding behind a quiet demeanor and a tragic past? For many, Mathurin's early release remains a stain on the French justice system. 8 lives, traded for 18 years. Was that justice? We may never have all the answers. What we do know is this: Thierry Paulin never stood trial, never faced his victims' families, never truly paid. He died before justice could be served, and in doing so, he robbed the world not only of lives, but of closure. And you are watching the Mystery Cases channel, where we together explore the most mysterious cases, the most thrilling stories. And as usual, before we unravel the mysteries in today's case, please leave a like and a subscribe to support us. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.